Hi and welcome to part 7 of the Objective Secured 2022 Codex Aeldari release. My name's Mike and today we're going to be covering the vehicles of the craftworlds. The vehicles of the craftworlds have been around since 2nd edition with the initial release of the plastic Vyper jet bike, followed immediately by the Falcon grav tank. From there we've also had the metal Warwalker back in Rogue Trader, which was then superseded by the plastic one in 4th edition. Over the years we've also had the Fire Prism, the Wave Serpent, and the Night Spinner added to the roster of vehicles available. And most recently we've had the Webway Gate added as a fortification, which will also be included in today's video. Let's start with where it all began with the plastic tanks and vehicles for the Aeldar, the Vyper. The Vyper is a fast attack choice with 1 to 3 per squadron. It has a movement of 16, a weapon skill 6+, and ballistic skill 3+, strength 4, toughness 5, with 6 wounds, 2 attacks, leadership 8, and a 3+ save. Despite being a vehicle, because it only has 6 wounds, it does not degrade, which is a really important benefit it has. It comes with a shuriken cannon and twin shuriken catapult. The twin shuriken catapult on the model is mounted under the nose, whereas the cannon is the one mounted on the back of the vehicle. That cannon can be replaced by an Aeldari missile launcher, a bright lance, a scatter laser, or a star cannon. Unfortunately, in the most recent iteration of its rules, it cannot replace the twin shuriken catapult. It used to be able to run a double shuriken cannon, one underneath and one on top. Unfortunately, there's never actually been a part that fits this model to give it the underslung shuriken cannon. The closest we had was a metal component for the old jet bike from Rogue Trader in 2nd edition, particularly that the Shrieker jet bike. And that particular part did fit the hull of the Vyper. However, you had to bend it to make it fit under the canopy of the main body of the vehicle. So I'm assuming the reason we no longer have that option is because it has been removed, because there is no part that will actually fit the Vyper to let you do that. Like the majority of units featured in Codex Aeldari, the Vyper has Strands of Fate. Ride the Wind is its 2nd special rule, which gives it an auto advance of 6 inches, and its 3rd rule is it explodes when it's reduced to 0 wounds. On the roll of a 6, it deals 1 mortal wound to every unit within 3. It features the faction keywords Aeldari, Asoyani, and Craftworld, and the vehicle, Fly, and Vyper keywords. Apart from the model kit being exceptionally old and unfortunately looking slightly dated when compared to the much newer sculpts that we have available to the Aeldari, the biggest disadvantage the Vyper has in the Craftworlds list is that it competes for the very, very densely populated and highly competitive fast attack choices. It's not efficient to deliver scatter lasers or shuriken cannons when compared to Wind Riders. It obviously doesn't deliver any sort of combat ability. It's not infantry, so it can't perform actions. The biggest advantage it actually has is the other heavy weapon options it carries. And those sort of star cannons, missile launchers, and bright lances unfortunately can be brought elsewhere in slots that are less densely contested. I can definitely see people running Vypers for very cheap blocking units because they are vehicles and they do have fly. However, I feel like they're going to be quite rare in that regard. We're going to stick with the scout vehicle theme at the moment, and before we start looking at the tanks, we're going to look at Warwalkers. The Warwalkers have gone through several iterations over the years, firstly on square bases back at the very end of Rogue Trader and the start of 2nd edition. We got a new metal model. From memory, it was the tail end of 2nd edition, and then we got the plastic ones released somewhere, I think it was 4th edition, which we still have today. Forge would have released an alternate variant called the Wasp, which was a slightly more enclosed canopy and had jump jets. However, these are now legends. And if you're like me and you do have a number of Wasps, you can still use them as Warwalkers because the basic chassis, base size, and weapon payloads are all the same. Walkers come in squads of 1 to 3, much like the Vyper. They have a movement of 10, a weapon skill and ballistic skill 3+, strength 5, toughness 6, 6 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 8, and a 3+ save. And like the Vyper, they do not degrade. They start with 2 shuriken cannons, and each shuriken cannon can be replaced with a missile launcher, bright lance, scatter laser, or star cannon. They have Strands of Fate like all Craftworld. They also have advanced positions like the Rangers, allowing them to get a much more aggressive deployment option. They have power fields, which give them a 5+ invulnerable save. Now this power field is heavily toned down from its first iteration, which gave when you hit the crew member, who was certainly more exposed back in those days, he had a 2+ invulnerable save. Now he actually gets a cockpit, but it's only a 5+. The Warwalkers do also explode on the roll of a 6 and inflict 1 mortal wound within 3 inches. Much like the Vyper, they are Vehicle and Warwalker, Eldar, Asciani, and Craftworld for their keywords. The biggest advantage of the Warwalker is obviously its advanced positions combined with heavy weapons. Those heavy weapons can be brought to bear on angles that the opponent might not expect, particularly if you're deploying them late in the process for your army. Bright Lancers, Star Cannons are probably my two favourite picks if you are going down that road of super heavy weapons, although they can be really viable because they are super cheap with just a pair of scatter lasers at 55 points a model. The Shuriken Cannons, obviously, when built with Hail of Doom and certain other craftworlds, can be really effective as well, and only increase the points slightly. I think Warwalkers, again, deserve some serious consideration, and now that they aren't necessarily something that is required to provide mass heavy weapons, you can tailor them and bring pairs or even solo ones to start putting pressure on certain parts of the table and increasing your deployment options. I really like the Warwalker, and the fact that it is a T6 3+ save, 5+ invulnerable with 6 wounds that doesn't degrade does actually mean it takes some killing, and the movement 10 really helps it as well. From the Warwalker, we've got 4 tanks to look at today. 3 of them fill up the heavy support, and 1 sits in the dedicated transport slot. We're going to start with the humble Falcon. The Falcon has been a much maligned tank over the years, mostly unduly, and I think we're in a really good position now where the Night Spinner, the Falcon, and the Fire Prism all perform unique roles, and all are about the same points cost for those roles. The Falcon is a movement 16, weapon skill 6+, ballistic skill 3+, strength 6, toughness 7, 12 wounds, 3 attacks, leadership 8 with a 3+ save tank. It does degrade on its 6th wound and 3rd remaining wound, with its movement dropping to 12 and then 8, its ballistic skill dropping from 3+ to 4+ and then to 5+, and its attacks dropping from 3 to D3 to 1. It comes equipped with a pulse laser, a scatter laser, and a twin shuriken catapult. The scatter laser can be replaced with a missile launcher, Bright Lance, Shuriken Cannon, or Star Cannon, and the twin shuriken catapult can be replaced with a single shuriken cannon. It also has the options to add a crystal targeting matrix, a set of spirit stones, a set of star engines, or a set of vectored engines. The weapon of choice, though, when the reason you're picking the Falcon, is the pulse laser. The pulse laser is a 48-inch range heavy 2, strength 9, -3 AP, D3 +3 damage. I would argue it's probably one of the most effective heavy weapons the Eldar have access to, and unfortunately you can only access this weapon on the Falcon and on the Crimson Hunter. The pulse laser kind of does everything you want a heavy weapon to do. It's got a good rate of fire, with a good range, with a high strength, with a good AP, with consistent damage. It's basically a combination of a Bright Lance and a Star Cannon mashed into one, and I really like the pulse laser. It's something that cannot be undersold. In terms of its vehicle upgrades, the Crystal Targeting Matrix allows you to ignore any or all modifiers when you roll to hit, which can be nice if you've got the points left over. Spirit Stones count as double the amount of wounds remaining for the purposes of which profile to use. It's okay. I feel like the Spirit Stones get more mileage on something like a Wave Serpent, which is much more durable. Star Engines add 3 to the model's movement, which is pretty amazing, particularly when you combine it with something like Children of the Skies, which in turn means that you've got a 21-inch move, which is pretty scary. And Vectored Engines, which is probably the most important of the options if you do choose to take them, is it lets you, once per battle in your command phase, activate the Vectored Engines, which allows you to battle focus that turn. That sort of move, shoot, move option on a Grav tank is absolutely amazing. That being said, I actually don't think any of these are required for a Falcon. Keeping them, they start at 140 points. Most of the ones that I've tended to work out in terms of weapon payloads end up somewhere between 150 and 160 points by the time you pick weapons for them. And the basic 140 point option is actually really viable. There's nothing wrong with it. It has the Strands of Fate ability, but it also has Sudden Assault, allowing it to deploy in reserve and then Deep Strike onto the table. Now, Sudden Assault is combined with another special rule it has called Cloud Strike. Cloud Strike is essentially giving this unit the ability to Deep Strike in turn 1, much like a drop pod. The rule reads, if this transport starts the battle, set up preparing a Sudden Assault. It can be set up on the battlefield in the reinforcement step of your first, second, or third movement phase, regardless of any mission rules. Any units embarked within the transport model immediately disembark after it has been set up on the battlefield in this way, but they must set up more than 9 inches away from enemy models. So essentially it turns the Falcon into a drop pod. Now, there are plenty of units that will gain significant benefits from this. The most obvious is the Fire Dragons, with their limited range and small unit counts. Dropping 6 of them in your opponent's lap with melter guns and fragging a very specific target works really well. It is a heavy points investment though. I actually feel like the Cloud Strike ability works really well for something like Dire Avengers or even small units of Void Scarred Corsairs. I've heard people say they want to use Howling Banshees in the space, and obviously an Assault unit with Strands of Fate to give them that auto 6 for one of their D6s for charge makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure 6 Howling Banshees or 6 Striking Scorpions or the equivalent thereof is going to be enough punch to deal with anything but the smallest targets, and at that point the firepower from a unit of Dire Avengers combined with the Grav Tank is often enough to kill whatever you're trying to kill with Howling Banshees. The tank also has the hover tank rule, which means that you measure from the model's base or hull, whichever is closer, and it does explode when destroyed on the roll of a 6, dealing D3 mortal wounds within 6 inches. It has a transport capacity of 6. And those 6 can be Phoenix Lords, Anrathei, or Asiani infantry. Wraith constructs count the space for 2 infantry models, and you cannot transport jump pack models. I've heard a few people ask, well, why does it mention Wraith constructs? It mentions Wraith constructs primarily because if you have a damaged unit of Wraith Guard or Wraith Blades that you're trying to preserve, there is nothing stopping 2 or 3 of them embarking on a Falcon Grav Tank. Obviously you can't start there because your unit size starts at 5, but late game or mid game, redeploying a unit of 3 D-Scythe or Wraith Cannon, Wraith Guard to a more advantageous position on the battlefield for turn 4 or turn 5 can't be undersold. So the Falcon itself starts at 140 points, and you can really load it out. If you go through all of its war gear, upgrade its main gun, upgrade its secondary gun, upgrade its tertiary gun, you do get a tank that will sit around the 200 point mark. And I just think that's too expensive. I think most of the war gear options are, I don't know, I think there's something that you take when you get to the end of your build and you have 10 points left over here or there. I feel like I would rather be, instead of taking a Crystal Targeting Matrix and Vectored Engines on 3 Falcons, you can save those, I think, 60 points and use them to buy 5 more Dire Avengers. So I do feel like you have to be very careful when equipping any of the Grav Tanks because there is a very easy pitfall to fall into in terms of taking all these options. Moving on from the Falcon, we hit the second Grav Tank release, which was the Fire Prism. The Fire Prism got an updated model when the Night Spinner was released. From memory, it was 6th edition. Much like the Fire Prism and the Falcon share the same basic profile in terms of its characteristics and its degrading profile. Instead of its turret being the pulse laser and a secondary weapon system, it replaces those for a Fire Prism cannon. Well, the Prism cannon itself is now down to just 2 profiles. In its previous iteration, it had 3. And to be fair, I think that these 2 profiles, you never fired the 3rd profile anyway, so I think these 2 work just fine. It has a twin shuriken catapult underslung, and you can swap that catapult for a cannon, and like the Falcon, it can also gain the 4 vehicle upgrades as well. It does have Strands of Fate, it does have Hover Tank, and it does have Explodes, but it has no transport capacity. What you're paying for here is 160 points worth of Prism Cannon. The Prism Cannon's 2 profiles are Focused Lance and Dispersed Pulse. The Lance shot is a 60-inch Heavy 2, Strength 14, -5 AP, D3, 3d3 damage, while the Dispersed Pulse is 60 inches, Heavy 3d3, Strength 6, -2, 2 damage blast. These 2 profiles should scare the bejesus out of whoever stands in front of a Fire Prism. Unless they have a significant invulnerable save, that Focused Lance will put holes in most vehicles pretty comfortably, and the Dispersed Pulse Heavy 3d3 with blast means that if you have big squads of big units in terms of 11 or more models, you're in for a bad day. The main reason though you take a Fire Prism is for the Link Fire Stratagem. The Link Fire Stratagem is something that will be covered more in depth in a later episode, but the abridged version for today is it allows multiple Fire Prisms that can see each other to pick one Fire Prism to fire from, essentially allowing you to have 2 out of line of sight, but being able to see the third, and the third being used for line of sight and targeting purposes, and you have to fire all 3 of them at the same target. However, the one that's firing ignores invulnerable saves, which means that if you have 3 Fire Prisms link firing, you then have a heavy 6, strength 14, -5 AP, 3d3 damage with the ability to ignore invulnerable saves, and at -5 it essentially ignores all armor as well. The 3 Fire Prism combo will essentially one-shot most super heavy knights. On average dice, it will destroy a Storm Surge, it will destroy any Wraith Lord or Wraith Knight you put in front of it. The main disadvantage, of course, is the fact that it's command point heavy, and the loss of Fire Prisms obviously renders the stratagem less effective for the same costs. So, in that situation, if you are going to be leveraging that synergy with the 3 Fire Prisms, giving 2 or even 3 of them vectored engines can be quite viable to allow you to move out, shoot, and move back in again. That being said, I often wonder whether you're just simply better off using your 1 free command point a turn to use Fire and Fade and keep the grav tank safe without having to randomize the dice roll. So the Fire Prism, unfortunately though, due to its direct fire nature and the prevalence for obscuring and heavy terrain boards, it does become a little bit less appealing when compared to its counterpart and sister tank, the Night Spinner. The Night Spinner, like the Falcon and the Fire Prism, shares the same damage profile, weapon skill, ballistic skill, etc. And much like the Fire Prism, it swaps the turret and the transport capacity for a Doomweaver battery. Again, it gains all the options for vehicle war gear and can swap its twin shuriken catapults for a shuriken cannon, and it has the same abilities. The Doomweaver profile is a 48-inch range heavy 2d6, strength 7, -2, 2 damage weapon. It has blast, and it can target units that are not visible to the bearer. The indirect fire rule, which is what most players call this particular rule, is perhaps one of the most important rules in the game at present. The ability for this vehicle to sit in relative safety out of line of sight somewhere towards the backfield, firing 2d6 shots at strength 7 -2, 2 damage into things that you can't see, particularly units that like to hug the backfield to score their own objectives, the cheap expendable units that a lot of armies do use for that. The Night Spinner becomes invaluable for that. The Night Spinner is also the cheapest of the 3 tanks because the Falcon you'll tend to give a few weapon options to, and the Night Spinner is just natively 20 points cheaper than a Fire Prism. It's one of the few spots I'd consider giving a crystal targeting matrix, simply so that you know that you're always going to hit on 3s. So I think the Night Spinner, if you're not running 1 in a heavy support slot, I think you're doing your army a disservice, and I think most good Eldar armies will probably run 2. I've been running 2 with very pleasing results, and I've been eyeing off a 3rd to see what else we can achieve with it. So I think that when you're looking at heavy support choices for the 140 points that a basic Night Spinner costs, you can't go too far wrong. I really like them, and I think that that ability to reach out and impact the battlefield from relative safety into units that thought they were safe just is so valuable at the moment. The last grav tank is actually the dedicated transport of the Craftworld faction. It's the Wave Serpent. The Wave Serpent had an armor cast model way back in the day in Rogue Trader in 2nd edition. It was replaced by a Forge World kit in 3rd edition, and then we got the new plastic kit in 4th edition. The Wave Serpent is mostly the same profile as the other tanks in that it has the same movement 16, weapon skill 6+, ballistic skill 3+, strength 6, toughness 7. It has 13 wounds instead of 12, but the same 3 attacks, leadership 8 and a 3+ save, and it degrades the same way at 6 wounds and at 3 wounds respectively, in the same way the other tanks do. It comes with a twin shuriken cannon on the top turret, a twin shuriken catapult underslung, and the Wave Serpent Shield. Much like the other tanks, it can swap its underslung shuriken catapults for a single shuriken cannon, and its top-mounted weapons can be swapped for either a twin missile launcher, twin bright lance, twin scatter laser, or twin star cannon. And it also gets the same options for the crystal targeting matrix, spirit stones, star engines, and vectored engines. What you're buying this tank for, though, ignoring its abilities again because they represent the same 3 that everyone else gets, explodes, hover tank, and strands of fate, you're buying it for the transport capacity. The transport capacity is 12, Phoenix Lord and Rethay or Asayani infantry. Again, Wraith constructs take up 2, and you can't transport jump infantry. This means you can get 5 Wraith Guard and a Spirit Seer and a Farseer on foot into this one tank. You could run a full squad of 10 Hurling Banshees plus Jane Zar plus another Autarch. You could run any combination thereof. And I think that the combination of everything there is really important. The Serpent Shield is actually what pushes it over the edge in terms of defensives for transport though. The Serpent Shield, while it's active, gives the model a 5+ invulnerable save against ranged attacks, and means that an unmodified wound roll of 1, 2, or 3 for a ranged attack that's made against this model always fails, irrespective of any abilities the weapon or the model making the attack may have. So this is the same as the transhuman rule that was introduced earlier in the edition, particularly for the Deathwing for the Dark Angels and through various stratagems available to Space Marines. So a toughness 7, 13 wound tank with a 3+ save, a 5+ invulnerable save, and transhuman is an immeasurably difficult transport to put down. I think most armies would be quite happy to run a Wave Serpent with just a double Shuriken Cannon on the top, a single Shuriken Cannon on the bottom with no other upgrades, and it would be a very, very, very viable transport tank. And the Eldar are no different. It's important to make sure whatever you're putting inside the tank is actually going to be valuable to you, though, because it is a heavy investment at 150 to upwards, if you really wanted to go, as high as 200+ points. I, again, feel like going a double Scatter Laser or double Shuriken Cannon on the top and a single Shuriken Cannon on the bottom is more than enough anti-infantry fire to add to your army. Obviously, the Shuriken Cannons will be more valuable for something like Hail of Doom. The Scatter Lasers are completely viable with 12 shots off the top of the tank. If you need more anti-tank firepower, putting Bright Lancers or Star Cannons up there can be also very valuable. I don't think the missile launcher is worth talking about, unfortunately. I think the missile launcher, if you're looking for that sort of mid-range weapon that can target heavier or lighter targets, the Shuriken Cannon might actually be more viable. The Wave Serpent Shield also does have a stratagem attached to it. The stratagem is called Shield Discharge for 1 command point. Use the stratagem at the start of your charge phase. Select one model from your army that is equipped with a Serpent Shield or Wave Serpent Shield. So this also works on the Storm Guardians that have their own Serpent Shield platform. You then select one enemy unit within 12 of that model. Until the end of that turn, the enemy unit cannot fire Overwatch or set to defend, and each time an enemy model in that unit makes a melee attack, subtract 1 from the hit roll. After using this stratagem, the selected model is no longer considered to be equipped with a Serpent Shield or Wave Serpent Shield. So this actually goes way back when to the original Wave Serpent had an ability to essentially put a pulse out from the front of its bow, pushing enemy units away, making them easier to be charged. At one point the rule became much more like a shooting attack and it delivered mortal wounds, and we're now back to something that is a once per game ability to really make an assault decisive. This obviously will work really well with things like Howling Banshees, Striking Scorpions, Wraith Blades, anything that wants to get out of the Wave Serpent and charge. If you could put Harlequins or even Drakari Witches or Incubi in there, they'd be great, but unfortunately you can't do that. I think the no Overwatch thing is a little bit overshadowed, particularly because it's going to be Howling Banshees that you want to put in this, and they already ignore Overwatch. And the -1 to hit doesn't actually do anything for them either, because they are natively -1 to hit in combat. But for something like Wraith Blades or Striking Scorpions, to a lesser extent even certain other things like the smaller Seer Councils that might want to get out and fight with Witchblades and Singing Spears, certain things like a Void Scarred or a Void Reaver Corsair Band armed for close combat with Power Swords. There are some options there that will benefit from using the Serpent Shield stratagem. The difference is that, unlike previous editions where you would quite happily shoot multiple Serpent Shields to deliver those mortal wounds every turn, you're not going to be doing that anymore. So that covers the vehicles. We do have one more data sheet to look at today before we wrap up, and it's something that I know a lot of the community have been really excited about, is the Webway Gate. The Webway Gate features 2 Wraithbone Archers, and you can only include 1 Webway Gate unit in your army. It has 3 separate rules, and it is a fortification. Unlike previous iterations for this model's rules, it can't be destroyed. Once it's on the table, it's there. It becomes a terrain feature. It used to have a toughness and wounds characteristic, which made it ultimately very vulnerable to enemy units just simply destroying it so you couldn't use it. Not so anymore. Also, it does have the faction keywords to allow it to go into Asuryani, Harlequin, or Drakari armies. And it also has the obstacle, Webway Gate, and terrain feature keywords. So it's 3 abilities. Mysterious Appearance. During deployment, when you set up this unit, it can be set up anywhere on the battlefield that is more than 12 inches away from the enemy deployment zone and any enemy models. When this unit is set up on the battlefield, both of its archers must be set up within 3 inches of each other. And once it has been set up, each bone arch is treated as an obstacle terrain feature with light cover, heavy cover, unstable position, and inspiring Aeldari for its terrain traits. This set of rules for its placement is probably the biggest point of contention for this model. The first thing it says is can be set up anywhere on the battlefield that is more than 12 inches away from the enemy deployment zone and enemy models. Now, terrain natively when setting up the table, the terrain needs to be 3 inches apart and also be away from the board edge. There are 2 arguments to this side. One is that you have to follow those rules because they are the terrain rules. The other is that that only applies when setting up the battlefield, and this model isn't done during setting up the battlefield. So can you just simply deploy it wherever you feel like? I strongly suggest talking to your TO or waiting for an FAQ for this to clarify exactly what they mean. The second part of the confusion comes from both of its Wraithbone archers must be set up within 3 of each other. How you're measuring that is also up for conversation. The model doesn't have a base. Now, if you're setting the Wraithbone archers up with between 3 of each other, then you could measure from the very tops of the archers, which means that the bottom of the archers are about 7 inches apart. You could also argue that you have to have the bases close, which means you can put them side by side, and they would still meet the criteria. There's no real illustration or defining way of setting this up, and I feel like this particular unit should have had an illustration to go with it to show this is how you deploy it, this is what it means when you're setting it up on the table. Once you've actually got it on the table, you also do have an option, potentially, because it is a fortification, to remove a piece of terrain in your own deployment zone and replace it with a Webway Gate. I feel like most Eldar players are going to be looking for a place they can just simply deploy it legally on the table, and because of the way it's worded that you have to be set up within 3 of each other for the archers, squeezing it into smaller spaces is actually going to be pretty viable to do. It feels a bit wrong, but until we get some more clarification, it's hard to argue when you are following the letter of the law. I think most people, though, will be reasonable and understand it's meant to form an arch. The second rule it has is Webway Travelers. If your army includes this unit and you're using the Strategic Reserves rule, you can halve the command point cost required to place units in Strategic Reserves. So this is really awesome. It means that you're obviously able to put more things off the table for less command points. The third rule it has is Webway Strike. Each time an Aeldari unit from your army arrives from Strategic Reserves, you can choose to set it up anywhere on the battlefield that is wholly within 6 of the archers of a friendly Webway Gate. If you do so, that unit can be set up within 9 of enemy units, and can even be set up within engagement range of enemy units. If an Aeldari unit is set up within engagement range, it counts as having made a charge move. An Overwatch cannot be made against it until the end of the turn, and that unit can target any enemy unit that is engagement range of it with melee attacks, even though it did not declare a charge this turn. So I've seen people say you could just sort of surround the Webway Gate to block it so that you can't really deploy. I don't think that's necessarily a viable option, because depending on how you deploy those 2 archers, first of all, it's a very big space. Secondly, you can set up, as long as you're wholly within 6, you can set up in engagement range, which means you need a lot of models. I think armies like a Poxwalker Horde could potentially do it, or a Tyranid Gaunt army, that sort of thing. But at the same time, if you know you're dealing with those, then you would be potentially a bit more conservative with the deployment of your Webway Gate to make sure that you weren't going to be surrounded. But what this does do is allows you to deploy this arch essentially up to and including the midboard, as in the halfway point of the table, and use it as a launching off point for your units, so that your opponent, if you're deploying it roughly centrally, particularly on an objective, then the ability to have units come on from turn 2 onwards and essentially move out of it, charge, and, begin fighting. Delivering a unit of 10 Wraithblades with axes and shields, for example, could be super useful. The Avatar of Cain, Wraith Lords, any of the larger Wraith constructs will benefit immensely from it. And because you are halving your command point cost to put those units into strategic reserve, it actually becomes a really viable choice. There's a lot that could be said about the Webway Gate. I feel like there are going to be events, and I know there are several around the world that simply don't allow fortifications. I think this is an indication that we are going to be moving down a road where, between this and the GT 2022 book that talks about replacing terrain with fortifications, that Games Workshop is making a concerted effort to make sure that these awesome unique models for each faction do actually get an opportunity to be used. I would still suggest with the Webway Gate's mysterious appearance ability that you speak to your TO before submitting a list so you understand exactly what their expectations are in regards to deploying it, how it needs to be deployed, and whether you can deploy it within range of terrain. And it's not especially raw driven reading, is I would expect a player coming to one of our events to be deploying it the way it was intended, to form an arch, rather than side by side, which I have seen people do. I would also be saying to people that because I'm expecting you to take up such a massive space, that deploying it within 3 inches of another terrain piece I would probably deem acceptable, because we do have quite dense terrain boards. However, I would only allow you to do that if there were no other legal deployment options. So if there was space on the table to legally deploy it more than 3 inches away, I would expect you to place it there. If there were no legal positions, then I would allow you to fudge it into the right position at less than 3 inches. I'd be really interested to hear what you think down in the comments, because this is a very unique situation for a model that probably needed more information for the players to make sure they were playing it correctly. So that covers the remaining vehicles for the Craftworld forces, and that ends today's episode. If you want to check out episode 1, it covers the Aspect Warriors, episode 2 covers the Corsairs, episode 3 the Inari, episode 4 the Psykers and Psychic Powers, episode 5 was the Wraith Constructs, episode 6 was the Guardians, Rangers and the Autarchs. Episode 8 will cover the army-wide rules like Strands of Fate, as well as the Craftworld rules, and episode 9 will be covering the Relics, Warlord traits and Stratagems. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you again soon.